problems versus the vanity. I think the key thing was to focus on getting grant money and raising VC versus actually solving a customer problem. And I think doing that again today is where the real value lies.
Perfect. David, I am going to come to you, but I do know that you have a question for someone on our panel. So I don't know if you want to ask the question now or at the end.
Well, first, I think they were cheering for you, Melvin, in your response. So I think that was the support was. Can I revisit what I said earlier and then ask my question?
Yes, please.
Because it's to Mashombi now.
Yes, please.
Because it's quite interesting. So, and I thought about your question a little bit more, just around in terms of what other markets in the future that we might see get more traction. And I was thinking about what has worked in these 4 markets so far that has allowed them to have traction. And I definitely think when you think about the total addressable market, I think there's, and Zach, you triggered this thought for me, there's kind of like 2 pathways, because you have B2C and B2B businesses, right? So I think in a market like South Africa, what's really benefited, but also maybe constrained it, is the corporate sector, because it provides a lot of B2B opportunities for businesses. And you see that in the type of fintechs and the type of startups. You also see that similarly in Morocco. Morocco has a lot of corporates as well. Whereas if I think about Nigeria and Kenya, which I think do have corporates, I think a lot of the innovation happened on the back of digitalization. Things like regulation that had allowed innovation within the finance space in particular. And I think if you look at Egypt as well, which you also think about those big 4s, they already had quite deep financial markets. They weren't starting from nothing. I mean, I think South Africa has the highest amount of private wealth, as well as the deepest capital markets. Behind that's not going to surprise you. It's Egypt, Nigeria, and Kenya. So what other markets are basically have similar context or emerging context that we can look to? I think Ghana's done a lot of interesting thing on digitalization. Morocco has a lot of interesting opportunity with corporates. Mauritius has done something really interesting and actually created a regulatory environment that's attracting businesses to register there, which then makes it look like it's taking a larger share from the rest of the continent. Actually, a surprising fact, Mauritius is the only country that has more companies registered in Africa, that is more companies registered in Mauritius than are operating there. Rwanda is the exact opposite. Rwanda has done something really interesting where you won't see great data in terms of the startup numbers, but when you go to Kigali, you feel the impact of innovation because they've been really welcome to attracting foreign businesses there. So I was thinking about these different pathways that you can take, learning from what's worked in these 4 markets, and I wanted to ask Mashombi, which one of them? Because I can see how it can work for fintech, I can see how it could work for e-commerce, I can see potentially how it could work even for climate and ag with the right type of funders. But manufacturing is one of the ones in our data and other data where I don't think people speak about it. So if I look at countries that I think could be well positioned to take advantage of that, both within the Big 4 and outside of the Big 4, which markets do you see and what type of opportunities are there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not seeing enough, is the short answer. But I think that the reason manufacturing excites me is the true transformation and actual ownership that countries can take hold of. And when I done the Matrix and I was listening to you go country by country, and I think that's a whole other panel to go country by country on where opportunities exist. So I think we're going to have a long conversation after this. But I think the reason manufacturing in particular excites me, and I see it as a gap, is that it's where we can take full hold of the value chain. Right, a business that we invested in earlier this year is in brick manufacturing, for instance, and being able to take waste from different environments like mining and put some polymers together, much more clever than I am, and kind of repackage bricks for 1/10 of the cost. The opportunity that we now have in Ghana with them is to create a brand new value chain for real estate development, with owning those bricks, with owning every single part of the value chain. And I think for me, that's the exciting part that I see that could exist. Yeah.
And I kind of want to come back to Zach's first. Sorry, I'm just gonna, and then so
it's fine. I think this is my co-moderator, everyone.
But I think this is really interesting because you can disrupt value chains and you can create new ones.
Yes.
And I'm interested in which is the opportunity VCs are interested in, or Melvin, which you're interested in as well, because I see that most of the funding has gone from disrupting existing industries. Yeah. And I think what we're seeing now with climate is trying to create a new industry and a lot of the challenges that might come out of that. But what's that trade-off in terms of challenges and opportunities that you guys see in terms of disrupting current value chains with tech versus creating new value chains with tech? And I'm not even sure if that's the right question, the right language.
Yeah. Do you guys want to take it and then I'll follow up?
Happy to kick it off. I mean, so, it's interesting. So when we were raising our first round of funding, we were speaking to a well-known VC fund in the US, and they were saying, the market for what you're doing is not big enough. Now, coming from banking and consulting, I could take Excel, and the next day, the market was magically big enough, and they gave us a term sheet. And I think often as investors, we're often hung up on the size of the market, theoretically, and saying, is it a multiple billion-dollar business? If you get one market, if you get 1%, is it $1 billion? Which I think is all good and well. But I think to the point you're alluding to is the best businesses are market-creating innovations. I think even more so in the African context, where the data you get could be from many places. I mean, and so it really comes down to, if you're solving a real problem, the problem you're solving may not be a market in and of itself, but if you're solving a real problem in a big space, the assumption is you could probably grow that market a bit further. And I think this is where it comes back to the fundamental point around startups, which I think we often forget is, back in the day they would say, are you providing a 10x better solution than what's being done today? If you're providing a solution that's that much better, you're more likely to grow the actual markets. And I think for me as an investor, I'm most excited about businesses that actually can find a niche and grow the market and build out something of scale over a period of time.
I also think that in Africa, I've mentioned this before several times, scaling into multiple countries is actually quite easy. It's not that hard compared to Europe, or certainly not as hard as compared to Asia. I mean, try to build a digital bank in, for example, Europe, and you start off in Germany. Good luck getting into France, even though you're right next door. It's because you have different legal systems, different languages, different rules of law, and it's just over-regulated. In Africa, even though we have 54 different countries, we only have 3 languages from a business standpoint. It's English, French, and Arabic. I mean, there's a little bit of Spanish and Portuguese, but those economies are tiny. No offense to any Angolans and Mozambicans here, it's a tiny market. But it's basically English, French, and Arabic. From a legal perspective, it's English law, Sharia law, and French law. So the percentage of African startups, and I'd love to get the big deals or Brighter's view on this, the percentage of African startups that are in more than one country pre-Series A is higher than the continent, in my view. So you'll see a lot of German, French, even UK-based startups that only expand beyond their home market at Series A or Series B. As founders in Africa, we got to take advantage of that and say there aren't that many bottlenecks to scaling. So you could build a business in a tiny market like Rwanda and be in Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania in less than 12 to 18 months. So this whole McKinsey, BCG, what's your TAM, your SAM, and your SOM is not really that relevant if you're an African startup. I mean, you could be a founder in Kigali and be as big picture thinking as a founder in Nairobi. Those borders are, and this is going a bit political, but who created these borders, right? These borders are completely unnatural. Right?
That's for your next panel, right?
That's for my next panel. But again, just be aware that in Africa, you could expand into multiple countries a lot easier. And the number, actually, we should have the Big Deal or Brighter or anyone do a study on the number of startups that are in more than one country before their series. I think Africa wins that by a country mile.
Report.
I was going to invite Maxime. He might already have that as one of his slides. But yeah, I definitely think that's a great question.
Thank you to my co-moderator. We have 10 minutes left, so I'm going to open it up to the floor for any questions. But before we do, can I please have a round of applause for my incredible panel? Any questions? Oh, 2 questions. 1, 2, 3.
Only because I didn't see anybody else asking anything. Thank you very much. Do you guys want to talk about exits? It was already mentioned briefly in the intro. It's what I understand is one of the big pain points. And when I try to pitch people that they should be paying attention here, it's one of their questions. How do we get out? And I've heard some great answers, but I'm wondering if there's going to be a diversity of opinions here. Thanks.
So, often when you talk about exits, it's almost like no one wants to put their hand up because they say, where's your fund DPI? And I guess the good thing of being an early fund is I've still got some investment periods, so I can be very free in my comments. I think it's an interesting one. I think the information shared by Maxime is quite fascinating, where one would think that on the African ecosystem, South Africa's lagging, yet most of the exits we saw up on screen were South African companies. I think the big question is how many of those were venture-backed? So PaySpace wasn't venture-backed, Swift wasn't necessarily venture-backed, and so there are quite a few up there that aren't necessarily seeing venture capital. So I think there's a question around, are we focusing on only exits of venture-backed businesses or exits of all businesses in the tech space? And that's, I think, important benchmark to actually have the conversation about, first of all. I think then the question then becomes, what do we deem as an exit? Because the reality is, because they aren't selling for billions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars, we aren't almost recognizing them and celebrating, which I think is unfortunate for us as an ecosystem. We need to be celebrating all founders in the space who are doing well and actually putting us on the map. But also to your question more directly, I think as an investor, you begin with the end in mind, and so if you come in early, you can think about, to whom is this valuable? I was speaking to my colleague Hailey yesterday about a company we're looking at now and asking the question, who do we think can actually buy this business in future for investing? And we're very intentional about thinking, how can we bring in those early investors into the business now, because we have the networks to bring them in. So almost being intentional about thinking about your exit's a key one. But finally, and I want to use this to pass the conch to my colleague Zach, is I think you can get smart on how you think about exits. You don't necessarily need to wait for a trade sale or an IPO to exit, because especially when you're an early stage investor. And I know Zach and the team have done some good work around thinking through different ways of exits in the current environment.
That was almost perfectly cued. Please forgive me if I talk a little bit. I mean, I was a complete nerd at school, so I'm going to talk about two famous mathematicians, Gauss and Pareto. Does anyone know who those two people are? Anyway, so the reality is venture capital is premised on Gaussian distribution, so the classic bell curve. But the reality is venture distributions follow a Pareto distribution, which is 20% of your companies account for 80% of your returns, on average, right? So if you try and apply a Gaussian model to create liquidity and then eventually DPI, which is returns to your founders, you're basically banking on, I don't know, 10% of your fund paying your entire fund back. So as African fund managers, we have to be aware that you cannot just copy a Silicon Valley model or a model in India or in, let's say, Berlin or London and expect a few companies to pay your entire fund back. And I spoke on a panel at ACES last week about this. If you look at the top sort of 1 or 2% of US VC funds that have returned more than 3x DPI, almost every one of them had a unicorn in their portfolio, if not more than one unicorn, right? Africa is at 7 unicorns. I mean, we had 11, and then we moved down to 7 because a few of them went below $1 billion. But look at the number of VC funds in Africa and the number of unicorns. So it is extremely rare for you as a fund to have a unicorn in your portfolio, or even a half a unicorn, right? South Africa is the most active VC market in Africa, maybe together in parallel with Nigeria, and South Africa does not even have, a half unicorn yet. Right, so I mean, Go One is, of course, but it's South Africa.
How are we categorizing
South Africa,
market?
Australia? It's a little. But what I'm saying is, as fund managers, you have to be able to balance liquidity with IRR. Right, very important. So if you can do secondaries at Series B, even late Series A, it recycles capital. This is extremely important because if, as angel investors, and I see a few angels in the audience. If you're sitting with your capital and it's stuck for 9 or 10 years, how are you going to magically invest in the next generation of companies? So in mature ecosystems, capital always recycles and invests in new businesses. And one way to do that is to do partial secondaries, because after 2 or 3 years, the value that you add as an angel or an early stage fund diminishes, right? So you pass the baton, just like in a relay race. And you can do that by getting partial liquidity, so there's less pressure on you in year 7, 8, and 9 of your fund. I mean, you guys are in the early days of your vintages, but talk to fund managers when they're close to year 9 or year 10, and they're sweating because they just want to sell assets, and they'll sell it at whatever price. Instead of doing that, start selling assets in year 5 and year 6, partial sales, and if you can sit with, let's say, 0.5x DPI in year 7, without having sold your top 10, you're sitting pretty. And that's what the African ecosystem needs. And for that, we need all the players in that relay race to collaborate and not compete.
Can I add maybe one thing as well, just on that? Because I think just we spoke a bit about it at the Unconference this weekend as well. And I just think, to your point, Ezra and Sax, we just don't know enough about exits. And I think that's what makes it really hard. Like, you have conversations with startups, and actually when they're going into round, people are exiting through secondaries. We don't have any data that shows us how people are getting capital return from that. Even within the exits that Maxine and Brighter are showing, we don't even really know the nature of those exits. Are they exits? Are they cash acquisitions? Who's actually returning capital? I think to Melvin's point as well, we don't even know if these were venture-backed or if they were kind of bootstrapped and got acquired. We don't even have that much information on how much these acquisitions are happening for. And I think to your point, Adam, that just makes it really confusing. So the simplest thing for us to say is there aren't enough exits, and just focus on that. And so what I think Brighter should do and other organizations should do is we need to figure out how we get better information on this, because this is what's attracting foreign investors to the continent, is that they know there are pathways to getting capital returned.
Yes, good morning. My name is Gugun Duli from Empress Global Academy. I think my question is twofold. The first is that obviously we're a startup, and as startups, coming in front of angel and VC funders is a challenge when we are grappling with an environment that is data poor, or rather that where it's difficult to actually find data that's reliable. Melville, you talked earlier about the development of markets or sectors, you know, how big a sector is. How do we actually, as startups, overcome this hurdle? Because at the end of the day, when you're sitting in front of a VC funder, they want to know how big the market is. They want to know where you can grow to and how big your business can actually grow to. But in the absence of reliable data and perhaps maybe even venturing into markets that don't currently exist, how do you actually sell that? Thank you.
Happy to start and have other colleagues chime in on that. I mean, early in our journey, one of our mentors, Paul Graham, told us, build something people want. And I want to use that as a starting point to think about markets, because as any startup that's building, you may have 1 or 2, 10 customers. And if you're able to say, look, we are solving this particular problem for this customer in this way, and we're capturing X dollars. We believe as we go deeper in that particular customer, we'll capture 5X dollars. We believe there are 10,000 more customers like this customer, and therefore that's the market. I think often when we think about market, we often go and say, let's go find the next World Bank report, and everyone quotes the World Bank reports about underfunded small businesses in Africa. But I think often your own experience is the best source of data to convince the scale of what you're doing, especially when you can say, like, look, I have a small group of people that love my product, we're making money from them, and there are X thousand others like them, and that's an easier conviction to get than saying, I'm quoting this source or that source.
I totally agree with what Melvin said. It's like the bottom-up approach is much more valuable first for you as a founder than any macroeconomic study, like knowing your market, because you actually know like your unique customers and you know how to serve him. Will serve you much better as an entrepreneur as you build, and it's also much more convincing for a VC or an investor because they can actually relate and understand like who you are addressing, and then they can do their own job counting how many of those customers they think there are in their market and then in the next one. So I think data, well, it's also part of the job of being an entrepreneur in Africa, is like you are building your own data as well, but this is incredibly valuable for you as an entrepreneur to rely on this type of data instead of like macroeconomic studies.
You're a founder, right? A little tip that I would offer is, as a founder, be aware that often the VCs that you talk to, at least the bigger ones, will know more about your sector and industry that you do, and that's okay. Simply because as founders, you may have the product, the tech, the resources, but we just see more companies, right? So just by a numbers perspective, through Startup Bootcamp and Launch Africa in the last sort of 8 years, this is no jokes, we've seen almost 10,000 startups, right? And this is not just a pitch deck. These are interviews we've had with founders in the last 7 to 8 years, right? So we know about if you're a fintech in Nigeria and payments, this is the average interchange rate and take rate you should have. If you're an e-commerce company in Kenya or East Africa, this is the percentage of GMV that's acceptable. So and it's not because we're better, we just see more things. So when you talk to VCs, be humble and say, hey, this is what we're building. What are your thoughts on this? Number two, always talk to VCs and know what their portfolio companies are and how they're performing before you pitch to them. That is the sign of a really mature founder. Like, I can tell you right now, the amount of DD that founders do on VCs is almost negligible. Because as founders, you expect us to do a deep DD on you, and we do so. But founder, I'm not sure about what your experiences are as fellow VCs here, but way too little founders know anything about us. Because we raise money from LPs, founders look at VCs as ATMs. We're not. Flash news, we're not. We have extreme amount of regulation and compliance and governance to deploy money on behalf of our LPs, but most VCs have their portfolio companies on their websites, or you can find it through, Brighter or Big Deal or VC for Africa, whatever our portfolio companies, and do a bit of research into, why did Launch Africa, why did Briga invest in this company? Because they have this. And what's even better, if you're figuring out your market sizing, figure out how you as a founder can benefit a VC's portfolio companies. The moment yes, it'll take a few additional days of your lives. Oh shit, days of our lives, that's an opera. But it puts you in such a better position when you walk into a VC's office. Because they know that you've spent enough time outside of your regular business day to research what a VC invests in, and it's almost a sure guarantee that you'll have a second meeting. And then your SAM, your TAM, your SOM, whatever, is almost irrelevant because a VC knows that you've spent quality time to see how you can benefit their portfolio companies. So it's a little tip.
So we have come to the end of the panel. I'd like to say a very big thank you to David, Mushambi, Malvin, Zach, Ode. It's been really, really great talking about the state of tech in Africa. And that's it from us.
Let's give another round of applause for our panelists there. Thank you. That was amazing. Really insightful. So for our next panel, I would like to call up Suzanne, who's our moderator. She's a startup consultant. And this panel is going to focus on scaling deep tech and AI solutions. So panelists, please come to the stage. Thank you. Hi. I think you've got